In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural dark wood floorboards material. So here is the procedural node setup, and after we create the procedural nodes, I'll show you how to join it together into this custom node group so that you can customize the material. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material, then we also just have the wood scale if I just want to scale the size of the wood texture, and then we have two different colors for the wood texture, so color 1 and color 2. So we have a lighter color and a darker color. Then we also have the knots texture scale, so if you want to make the knots smaller and have many more of them, you could turn that up. But then we also have the knots single scale, so this is going to change the size of the individual knots, so if you want to make them much bigger, you can. Then we also have the floorboards length, so if you want to make the floorboards longer or shorter, you can change that. And then we also have the floorboards width, so I can make them like really thin or much thicker. And then we have the floorboards edge size, and so if you turn this up a lot, you can see it kind of looks like a stylized wood. Then we also have the roughness of the material to make it more shiny or more rough. And then we have some bump settings, so we have the knots bump strength to make those bumpier. We also have the wood bump strength, and then we also have the floorboards bump strength. And then finally we have this wood rotation here, so if the floorboards rotation doesn't align up with your model, then you can change the wood rotation X, Y, and Z to rotate the wood texture around. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support the channel, then you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, as well as the Blender Market. I'll have the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser, with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And if you'd like to just purchase all of my procedural wood materials, then I've just released Blender Procedural Wood Pack number 1, and it just comes with my 10 procedural wood materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, definitely check out my Blender Procedural Material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. Links are all in the description. So I'll now show you my 3D setup if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and I went here to mesh, and I just added an icosphere, and then right behind me, once you add the icosphere, you can click here on the add icosphere settings in the corner, and I just turn the subdivisions up to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round, and I'll use the object context menu just to shade the object smooth. I'm also going to scale this object down by 0.2 and then hit enter, and I'll press Ctrl A and apply the scale, so that's the object's new default size, because the default objects in Blender are actually quite large. Then I also thought this would be nice to add it to a plane in the background, so I went to the add menu and I added a plane, and I just moved the plane in the background here, and I rotated it by 90 degrees, and I just scaled it up a bit, and then I pressed Ctrl A and applied the scale as well. Now as for the lighting, I added these 3 different area lights right here. So if you go to the add menu, you can just go to light and search for an area light, and so this first one here is an area light kind of on the back, and so if you go over to the object data properties of the light, I turn the power up to 40, and then I duplicated this one and added another area light right here, and then I also added this other area light right here just to give some nice bright lighting shining down on the objects, and I turned the power up to 70. Now also to get some more realistic lighting reflections, over here on the world properties, I added in this abandoned hopper terminal 01 HDRI, and this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com, and the link will be in the description if you'd like to download it. And on polyhaven.com, I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version. So this is going to give us some nice realistic lighting. Now let's also click right over here on the render properties, and I'm going to go down here to the film tab, and I'm going to check mark the transparent button so that the background is transparent. And then also let's go down here to the color management, and I'm going to use the view transform of Filmic, and I'll also set the look to very high contrast just to pop out the colors and make things more saturated. Then I also added a camera here, so if you go to the add menu, you can just add a camera, and I just pointed this camera at the object. And if you select the camera and go here to the output properties, I set the resolution to 1920 by 1920, so it is a square image, and I just kind of zoom the camera in. And then also with the camera selected, if you go to the object data properties, I turn the focal length of the camera up to 100 just to kind of zoom it in a bit. Now I also added this empty object right here, so if you go to the add menu, you can search for empty and just add the plane axis, and I just stuck this empty right here on the surface of the other object, and I did that so I could add a depth of field. So then if I select the camera, you can go to the camera settings, you can turn on depth of field, and then you can just choose a focus object. So I'm going to choose this empty object object here. And then you can play around with the f-stop value, and I just turned mine up to an 18, so the background will be just a little bit blurred, but then the main object here will be in focus. So those are just some things I did to the 3D scene if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So now you can select the object here, and I'm in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode, and I have the shader editor right over here. So I'll just click on new to add a new material, and I'll just rename the material to dark wood floorboards. And then I can also click and drag and drop the same material onto the background object. So they both have the same material. Now I'm also going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and then in Blender's user preferences over here on the add-ons tab, you can go to the search, and you can search for the Node Wrangler and just checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So I'll go to the add menu, and we're going to search here for the brick texture, and we're going to be using the brick texture as the base. And then because I enabled the Node Wrangler add-on, I can hold down the Control and Shift key and select different nodes, and that's going to preview the node on the object. And then also with the brick texture selected, I'll press Control T, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates, so I'll put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates will place the textures on the object more evenly. Now, depending on the rotation of your objects, you may not be able to see the brick texture. So what I'm going to do is select both of these objects here, so the plane and the sphere, and I'll press Control A, and I'm going to apply the rotation. That way, this is now the new default object's rotations. So for example, if you have a ground plane, like a plane here, and if I were to add this material to the ground plane, then it may look correct from the top looking down, and it does for this object. However, for my objects, I'm looking at them on side view, so I'm going to be using some of the mapping nodes to rotate it, but we can always change the rotation later with this mapping, because this mapping has a rotation X, a rotation Y, and a rotation Z. So you may need to change your rotation values slightly differently to the rotation of your objects. So what I'm going to do is drag these nodes back, and this is going to be used as the main scale of the object in the main rotation, but I want to add another mapping node to change the rotation of the brick texture. So I'm going to select the mapping node, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it here after the first one. Now here on this rotation, I'm going to change the X to 90 so that it rotates around, and now it looks correct from the side view. And then also the Z rotation, I'm going to rotate that by 90, and that way it'll rotate the brick texture going up and down instead of side to side. But then of course, if this is the wrong rotation for your object, you could change this rotation value here. So for example, you might want to change the X rotation to 90 just to rotate it back, and these values here will be added to the custom node group so that you can change the rotation for each object. Now I do want to keep my nodes nicely organized because this material is going to get pretty complex. So what I'm going to do is click and drag to box select these two nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll select the frame, and I can press F2 to add a label, and I can rename this to mapping. So now let's change the brick texture settings. Now I'm going to be adding a few different brick textures, and so I actually want to rename the brick texture. So I'll select the brick texture, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename it to main brick texture. And then here on color 2, I want to make this be fully black. And so you can see color 1 and color 2 are going to be some random different brick colors. And so I'm going to make color 1 fully white. So this way there's more contrast between some bricks which are darker and other bricks which are lighter. Also the mortar scale here, I'm going to turn this to 0 because I don't want to be able to see any of the mortar. And then also this brick width here, I want to turn this up to a 1 so that the brick width is a bit longer. And then here on the scale, I'm going to turn the scale to 8 so that everything's a bit smaller. Now I want to make the bricks look a bit more random. If I zoom out here, you can see the bricks don't really look that random. They're kind of all the same size. So this squash here, I'm going to turn this to a 1.4 so that the bricks are a bit more random. And then this frequency here, I'm going to turn this up to a 4. So now the bricks look much more random on a larger object. So I now want to duplicate this texture, and I want to make another one, which is going to be the edges of the floorboards. So I'll drag the texture down, and I'll press Ctrl Shift D. Ctrl Shift D will duplicate the nodes, but keep the wires plugged up, and I'll drop it up here. And I can Ctrl Shift and select this one. And I'll press F2 to give it a label, and I'm going to call this one floorboards. boards. Now for this one, I'm going to make color 2 be fully white so that there isn't any change between the color 2 bricks and the color 1 bricks. However, this mortar size here, I'm going to turn to a 0.002. And then this mortar smooth value, I'm going to turn this up to a 1 so that's a little bit smooth. So now if I zoom in here, you can see that there's just those little lines there on the edge of the floorboards. And then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now I want to add some even more variation to the size of the floorboards. So what I'm going to do is box select these nodes here and I'll bring them back and I'll select the main brick texture and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and I'm going to drop it down here. And I'll press F2 to add a label and I'm going to call this boards size variation. Now for this one, for now, I'm going to make color 1 and color 2 be fully white. But I want to leave all the other settings how they are. So now what I'm going to do is take this color from the board size variation, this one here, and I'm going to put it into the brick width. And this way, it's going to use the colors of the brick texture to randomly make them bigger or smaller. Let's also take this color here, and we'll put this one into the brick width because we want these two to both be the same. We want them to have the same size. And I'll Control Shift and select the main brick texture so we can see it a bit better. So now what we can do is also take this mapping vector, and we can put this into the vector of the board size variation so it's using the same mapping. And then also just to keep things more organized, I'm going to drag this up here, and then I'm going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire to add a reroute, and hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire to add another reroute. And I'm just going to kind of stick the reroutes right here just so that we can put this board size variation in the center. So now what I can do is change this color here. So on the board size variation, I'm going to make the color a bit darker, and you can see as I make it darker, that's going to change the random size of the boards. So if I make it really dark, there's like a bunch of small boards. What I'm going to do is just make it a very slightly darker gray color, just to add a slight variation. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using for color 1, you can go to the color and go to the hex value, and I'm going to be using the hex value of E6, E6, E6. So if I look here on this larger object, you can see that the boards have even more variation. So let's box select all these nodes here, so the mapping and the 3 brick textures. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll select the frame and add a label, and I'll rename this to brick base texture. So I'm now going to be creating the base texture for the knots. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop it up here, and I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. And let's use the same mapping, so the mapping vector is going to go into the vector of this Voronoi. And then I want to add another mapping node, so I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a mapping, and let's put this in between this mapping and the Voronoi, so just stick it right there. And then I can box select these 2 nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I can rename this to knots base. So now let's change some of the Voronoi texture settings. So on the F1 here, I'm going to change it to smooth F1 instead so the edges are smoother, and I'll turn the scale up to a 20, and you can see now we have little circles there for the knots. And then all the other settings I'm going to leave how they are. Now I do want to distort the Voronoi with a noise texture to make it look a bit more random and noisy. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and we can just stick the noise texture here in the knot space. Let's drag this out up here so we have a bit more space. And I'll drag the noise texture underneath this mapping. And then I will hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over the wire to add a reroute. And that way, now that we have a reroute, I can put this into the vector of the noise texture so it's using the same mapping. Let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it, and I can change some of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 10, and the detail here I'll turn up a little bit to a 4. And I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now if I put this factor instead into the vector and Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture, you can see it's very distorted. However, I don't want it to be that distorted, so I want to mix it together with this mapping. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for the mix color node, and we're going to drop the mix color node here in between the noise texture and the Voronoi. Now this mapping vector, this can go into color A, and then the noise texture factor, that can go into color B. And then here on the mix type here, I'm going to change this to the linear light instead. So now if I drag the factor around, you can see it isn't distorted at 0, but then as I turn up the factor, it's going to use more and more of the noise, so it's going to be more distorted. But I want the distortion level to be very small, so I'll turn this value to a 0.02. So it's just distorted a tiny little bit, but that'll make it look more random. Now I do want to stretch this Voronoi texture a bit because I want to make the knots look like they're a bit stretched. So here on the mapping, I'm going to change the scale. So I'm going to turn the X to a value of of 2, and then the Y I'm going to turn to a 1.7. Now there is a problem with this Voronoi texture. If I Control Shift and select the main brick texture, we're going to make it so that the texture location will be random per floorboard. But if I mixed in the Voronoi with how it is, then some of the floorboards would overlap and it would have the same knots texture overlapping the floorboards. So I want to make the location of this texture random with the brick texture. So to do that, we're going to take this main brick texture, we're going to put the color into the location value of the mapping. So now you can see that if the floorboard was cut out right here where the knot is, the knot wouldn't overlap to the other floorboard. Now I want to keep my nodes nicely organized, so what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire, and I can drag it back here. Hold down the Shift key, right click and drag, add another reroute. Let's drag this back right over here, so right there. And then also add another reroute here, drag this one down a little bit. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I just want to keep my nodes nicely organized. Add another reroute here, and I can drag this one up here. So now let's create the base texture for the wood. So I'm going to box select these nodes, and I'll bring them back a bit, and I'll go to the add menu, and for the base texture of the wood, I'm going to search for a noise texture. And let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And let's change some of the settings, so I'll turn the scale to a 6, also turn the detail to the max of 15, and I'll turn the roughness to a 0.85. And this laconarity value, I'm going to turn this up to a 3. And then the distortion, I'm also going to turn this up to a 3. And then we will be plugging up some mapping, but we're going to be doing that later. Now, I do want to make this look more contrasty, so I'm going to be adding a color ramp. Let's go to the add menu. I can search for the color ramp. We can drop it here after the noise texture. And then I can drag these values around to make them more contrasty. So what I'm going to do is drag a white tab right about here. And then I'll hold down the Control key and I'll click here to add another tab, and Control click here to add another one, Control click here to add another one, and then we'll add one more right here. And I'm going to have them changing between white and black. So this one here, I'm going to make this fully black. And then this one right over here, I'm going to make this fully black as well. So now what I want to do is I want to mix in the main brick texture, but then I also want to mix in the Voronoi texture of the knots. And we're going to be putting that into the vector, the noise texture, to make it more distorted. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a mix color to mix these two colors together. And then I'm going to take this main brick texture here, and you can see we have some reroutes here. So I can just take this wire here and I'm going to put it into the factor, and I'll Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Then I can mix it with the knots. So I'm going to take the knots Voronoi texture distance and I can put that into color A. And then here on color B, I'm just going to make this fully white. So now you can see we're mixing them together, and so you can kind of see some of those knots, and then you can also see the floorboards. So let's take the mix result and I can put that into the vector, the noise texture, to distort the noise texture. And I can Control Shift and select this color ramp to preview it. And let's kind of drag these both together just to bring them together and keep it nicely organized. Now there's a big problem with this, and that is that the knots are distorting the noise texture way too much. And so I need to make them less strong. First, let's box select these three nodes right here, and I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll add a label, and I'll call this wood base. So I now need to make the distortion less strong. So what I'm going to do is go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. And we'll put the color ramp here between the Voronoi and the mix. So stick it there. And I can also box select these nodes and drag them quite a bit farther back so I have more space. Now here on this color ramp, I want to make it more smooth. So on the linear type here, I'm going to change it to B-spline instead. And then I'm actually going to flip the two colors. So I'll drag the white one over here, and I'll drag the black one right over here. And then I'll hold down the Control key and click here to add another one. And this one I'm also going to make fully black. So they're both going to be a fully dark black texture. And I'm going to drag this over here. But you can see that by changing this to B-spline, even though these are both fully black, there's going to be kind of this gray value inside. And that's just going to make it look a bit more smooth. So I'm going to drag this tab to about here, and then this other one kind of in the middle here, and then the white one here. And of course you can drag these values around depending on the size of the knots, but I want to have the knots pretty small, so I'll drag these over so they're pretty small. Now later on in the custom node group, I want to be able to control the knot size. So I'm going to go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for the hue saturation value, and we'll drop this before the color ramp. Now this hue saturation value has this value to make the colors brighter or darker. So if I drag this value, you can see that that's going to change the size of the knots. So we'll be using this later in the custom node group. And as well as mixing in those knots and making them so they're not too strong, I also want to be able to stretch this noise texture. So let's add some nodes here to stretch the noise texture. So I'm first going to go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a mix color, and we'll put the mix color here after this color ramp. And on the mix type right here, I'm going to change this to difference instead. Now here on the color ramp color, I'm going to put this into color B. And then for color A, I want to use the original mapping. So if I go way back over here, you can see there's this reroute here, and this is going into the original mapping. So I can pull out a wire and I can stick this right here into color A. Now I want to be able to stretch the texture. You can see right now it is stretching the texture. If I control shift and select the color ramp, you can see the noise texture is being stretched, but I want to stretch it in a different axis. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a mapping node, and we're going to put this mapping node here in this wire that goes into color A. So stick it there, and I can drag these back and stick the mapping right here. So now the mapping is in between the difference and the color ramp. And let's change some of these values. So I want to change the scale. So on the scale X, I'm going to change this to 10. And then on the scale Y, I'm going to change this to a 0.5. And then here on the Z value, I'm going to change this to a 0.6. But you can see something is looking really weird. It's kind of stretching it over here, but it's kind of stretching it differently on these other areas. And that's because I just need to drag the factor up to make it stronger. So I'm going to turn this factor to a 0.8. Now you can see that the X values are kind of stretching that texture back and forth, and the Y values and the Z values are stretching it. And so now it really looks more like wood because we have this stretched noise texture. And then you can see these knots here are distorting the noise texture. The noise texture is being warped around the Voronoi, but it's not being controlled everywhere. It's just being controlled some spots here and there. And you can of course change the size of how big it's controlling it by changing the color ramp. So let's box select all these nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to Knots Distortion. I'm also going to drag the wood texture up a little bit, and then just to keep my nodes nicely organized, I'll hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire to add a reroute, and I'm going to drag this kind of up to about here. Make sure to press Ctrl S to save your project, and I now want to make the colors of the wood texture. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for another mix color, and let's put the mix color here in the wood base after the color ramp. And this color ramp here can go into the factor, so the white and dark values are going to tell it what parts are going to be color A and what parts are going to be color B. So for color A, this is going to be a nice light brown, and then for color B, this is going to be a dark brown. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, then here on color A, this is going to be a hex value of 69513E. That is the light wood, and then for the dark wood on color B, the hex value is going to be 1E0E08. And you can actually select this mix here, and you can press F2 to give it a label, and I'll rename this to base wood color. Now I also want to add a bit of a random tile color so that some of the tiles are a lighter color and other tiles are a darker color. So to do this, I can go to the add menu and I can search for a hue saturation value, and let's put the base color result into the color. And if I control shift and select the hue saturation value, I can now drag this value just to make it brighter or darker. So I need to mix this with the original color. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the mix color, and we'll stick this here. I can drag this node over and kind of drag this up here. And now I can take this base wood color and we're going to put that into color B. But then this hue saturation value is going to go into color A. Now for this hue saturation value, I'm going to turn the value to 0.5 so that it is half as bright. So now if I drag this around, you can see we're blending between the lighter one and the darker one. But instead of making it even between them, I want to use a texture to tell it what parts are going to be the lighter one and what parts are going to be the darker one. So to do this, we're going to be using this base main brick texture here. So what I can do is just click here on this reroute, and I can drag way over, and I can drag this up here and stick it into the factor of the mix. And then so that the wires aren't overlapping, I can hold down the shift key and right click and drag to add a reroute, and I can drag this way down here, and the principled shader, we can just drag it over here for now. And why this is working is because if I control shift and select the main brick texture, this main brick texture has lighter values and darker values. So that is going into this mix here, and so that's telling it to make some of the floorboards lighter and other floorboards darker. And just to keep these a little bit nicely organized, I'm going to box select these and bring them up a bit, and then I'll hold down the shift key and I'm going to right click and drag over these two wires to add a reroute. Let's drag this up here, and I can box select these nodes press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'll call this floorboards random color. Now another thing that I want to add to the base color is a dark area around the knots. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a color ramp. We'll put the color ramp up here. And then what I want to do is go way back over here to the knots. And I'm going to take this color ramp color and I'm going to pull out a wire and drag this way over here and stick it into the color ramp. And let's Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. And I just want to make a texture which is going to be the outside of the knot. I'm also going to hold down the Shift key and drag right there to add a reroute, and I'm going to drag this back over here just to keep it nicely organized. Alright, so now here on this color ramp, I can drag this black tab out here, and then hold down the Control key and click here to add another black tab and drag this back, and then the white tab is going to be in the very center. This way there's just going to be a white ring around where the knots are. So I'm going to drag this over here, and then I'll drag the black tab over here to make that ring a little bit more thin. So something like that is pretty good. So we now have some white rings wherever the knots are. So I'm now going to mix them into the base color. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the mix color node. We'll drop this here and I'll Control Shift and select it to preview it. And we want the color ramp color to be going into the factor. And then we're going to take the floorboards random color and we're going to put that into color A. So then here on color B, this is going to be that same dark color. So what you can do is hover your mouse over color B here on the base wood color. You can press Control C to copy the value. And then if you go over here to the mix, hover your mouse over the value and press Control V to paste that color. So now if I zoom in here, you can see there's a little dark area around all the knots. So I'll compress these nodes together and I'll box select them and press Ctrl J to add a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'll rename this to knots dark edges. And then I also want to add the floorboard edges. So let's box select these nodes and drag them back, and I can go to the add menu, and to mix that in, I'm also going to add a mix color and we'll drop it here after this one. And if I select the mix and press F2 to give it a label, I'm going to rename this to floorboard edges. So then for this value here, I want to add in the floorboards edges texture, which is this texture way down here. So I'm going to click and then drag and then let go right here, and then I can start to type, and I'm going to add reroute, and I'll drop the reroute here, and then I can drag this way over here, and then I can click and then drag and then let go here, and I can also add a reroute and drop this here. Let's maybe drag this a bit back here and drag this a bit back, and then I can click here and I can drag the reroute over, and I'm going to stick this into the factor. And so I'll go right up here to the floorboards edges now, and for color B, I want it to be the same dark brown color, so I'll drag this over here and stick it into color B. So now if I zoom in here, you can see there's the texture of the floorboards, however, it's being flipped. So what I need to do is take this mix result here, and I actually want to put this into color B, and then for color A, this is going to be that dark color. So now you can see there's just a little bit of dark color in between the floorboards. So this is it for the final base color, so I can put the result into the base color of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. And I'll just drag these nodes right up here. So I now want to create the roughness map, and so to do that, I'm going to start by adding a new noise texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop it here, and I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. And I want to use the same mapping, so I'm going to go way over here to this mapping, and I can take the vector and I'm going to drag this way over here and stick it into the vector of the noise texture. And let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 12, also turn the detail up a bit to an 8, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now I want to make this more contrasty, so I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp after the noise. And then I want to drag these values together to make them more contrasty. But then I want to mix in the wood base texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a mix color node, and we'll drop this here. I might want to drag these nodes forward a little bit. And then let's take this color ramp here in the wood base, and I'll take the color and I'll put that into color A. Then this color ramp color here is going to go into the factor. And then for color B, I'm going to make this color a gray color. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using, the hex value will be 5F, 5F, 5F. Now I also want to add another color ramp to change the colors a little bit to make it not quite as contrasty. So I'll select this color ramp and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it here after the first one. And with this color ramp selected, I'll hit the backspace to reset it. Now this color here, I'm going to have it be fully white, but then this color here on the other side, this is going to be a light gray color, and the hex value for this color will be 9E, 9E, 9E. So now we can take this color here, and I can stick it all the way up here into the roughness of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. So you can see there's some slight variation in the roughness, and especially if I kind of look over here on side view, you can see there's just a little bit of roughness variation. So let's click and drag to box select these nodes. We'll join them together into a frame. I'll add a label by pressing F2, and I'll rename this to roughness. And then later on, when we create the custom node group, I'm going to want to control the roughness values. So we're going to go to the add menu, and we're going to search for the hue saturation value, and we'll stick this here after the color ramp. So now the value is going to make it lighter or darker, and so that can change the roughness value. So we'll be adding this later into the custom node group. So I now want to create some bump maps, and we'll be putting that into the normal to give the texture some bump. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to search for a bump node. And I'm going to be creating the bump map over here, so I'll actually just drag it over here, and I can drag the roughness down a bit, and I can actually hold down the shift key and right click and drag a couple of times to add some reroutes, just to keep my nodes more organized, and I'll kind of drag this over here just to get it out of the way. So we'll be creating the bump maps right here. So the first one that I want to add is the floorboard edges. So this floorboard here, you can see there's a wire going all the way over here, and so what I can do is actually just take this one here, this reroute, and I can plug this into the height value of the bump, and if I Control Shift and select the bump, I can see what it's doing, and it's a bit too strong, so I'm going to turn the strength down to like a 0.2. So now I want to duplicate this bump node, so I'll press Shift D to duplicate, drop it here, and I'm actually going to have 3 of them, so I'll press Shift D to duplicate and drop another one here. So all the normals are going into the normals of these bumps, but then we have height values that we can add in the other information. So the next one that I want to add is this base noise here. So let's take the noise factor, and I can drag this into the height value right here. And then if you want to add a reroute, you can. So I'll just add a reroute there and kind of drag it up there to keep it more nicely organized. And you can see that's giving some really nice bump there. So on the strength here, I want it to be a bit less strong, so I'll turn it to a 0.15. And then for the last one here, I want to add those knots. So we can actually go right up here, and I'm just going to be using this color up here from the knots dark edges. So we'll put the color into the height value of that bump, and I can see that's nice and bumpy. I do want it to be much less strong though, so the strength value, I'll turn it to a 0.05. And then I also want to click on the invert here to make it look like it's going back in instead of coming out. All right, so I'm going to box select these nodes here, and I'll join them together into a frame and maybe drag this down a little bit. And then if I select the frame and press F2 to add a label, I can just call that bump. And then I might just compress these nodes a little bit down so they're more organized. So then we need to take the final bump normal, and we need to put that into the normal of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. And I'll zoom out here, and there is the finished procedural material. So to join it together into a custom node group, I want to click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. And if you hit the tab key, that's going to go in and out of the node group. Let's drag the node group over next to the material output, and I can drag it out to make it a bit bigger. And then I want to copy the material name, and I want to paste it here in the node group so it says dark wood floorboards. So I'll hit the tab key to go inside the node group, and I'll press the N key to open up the side panel, and I'm going to click over on group. And here on the BSDF, I'm just going to rename this to shader because I like that better. So now if I go over here to the left side, we have this group input, and we can plug values up to the group input, and then that way we'll be able to control them outside of the node group. So I'm going to drag this group input right here inside the mapping, and I want to add the scale and the rotation. So let's first take the scale here, and I'll put that into the extra socket. And then if I click on the scale, I don't want it to be 3 values. I want it to be 1 value instead. So I'll click on the type here, and I'll change it to float. And then the default value, I want to turn that to 1. And then if I go outside of the node group, this scale here, I want to turn that to 1. So now this can control the size of the entire material. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to add in this rotation value, but I'm going to be adding this at the very end because I want it to be at the bottom of the custom values. Now to make this a little bit more clean and neat, I'm actually going to be duplicating the group input. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate and drop this up here, and I can press Alt P to bring it out of the frame. So we can actually duplicate the group inputs and we can add them up to the custom values, and that will just make it a little bit nicer. So I want to drag this group input way over here, and I want to stick it right here in this wood base. And I want to plug the scale value in, so I'll plug the scale scale into the extra socket here. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'm going to call it wood scale. Then I want to duplicate the group input again. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate, drop it here. And I want to plug up the two colors. So I'll plug A into the extra socket and then B, plug that up into the extra socket. And then I can double click on this to rename them. And I'll rename this to color 1. And then also I'll rename this to color 2. And then if you select the group input, you can press Control H, and Control H is going to collapse the node. So you'll only be able to see the values that you're going to use. However, we're going to continue to add more custom values. And so at the very end of the entire setup, we'll select all the group inputs and we'll press Control H just to make them smaller and collapse them. But for now, let's select the group input and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, drop it here, and I'll press Alt P to bring it out of the frame. And I need to press Control H to uncollapse it so we have the extra value there. And what I want to do is drag this group input right over here. And I want to put color B and color A here. I want to put those into the same color too, so that that dark color controls all three of those colors. So I'll put B into color 2, and then color A, put that into color 2. So if I go outside of the node group, you can see that color 2 is going to change the colors for all of those colors. So let's go back into the node group. And I'll press Shift D to duplicate this again. And I want to drag this way back here, and I'm going to put it inside the knots base. So let's just drag it here underneath the linear light. And this scale value here, this is going to control the knots texture scale. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket here, and I can rename it to knots texture scale. And then right over here on this hue saturation value, this value is going to make the knots bigger or smaller. So I'll put the value into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to knots single scale. Then I'll duplicate this again, and I'll press Alt P to bring it out of the frame. And I want to drag it here and stick it inside the brick base texture. And I'm actually going to drag it up here and put it right here above the mapping. Now, right here in color 1, if I make this a brighter color or a darker color, that's going to change the length. So what I want to do is control that with a value. So what I'll do is go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the hue saturation value and I'll drop it here. And then this color 1, I want to drag this and drop this here. So now this color here and this color have the same value. So I can put this color here into color 1. So now we have this value and this will make it brighter or darker. So I can put the value into the extra socket here and I'll rename this to floorboards length. So if I go outside of the node group, I can drag this floorboards length value. So let's go back into the node group. I'll press Shift D to duplicate this and we're going to drag another one down here. And I want to control the floorboards width. So this row height here on all the textures, this is going to change the width. So I'll take the row height and I'll put that into the extra socket. And also this row height here, put that into the extra socket. And also this row height here, we can put that into the same socket. So that single value controls both of them. And then also this one here, this row height, this needs to be plugged into the same one. So the row height, put that into the extra socket. So you can see now they're all being plugged up to the same socket. I'm going to drag this back here, and then I can hold down the Shift key and right click and drag to add a reroute there, just to keep the nodes nicely organized. But then this row height here, I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to floorboards width. So if I go outside of the node group, you can see that's now going to change the width of those floorboards. And because we added in all of these 3 brick textures here, it's controlling the floorboards and the main texture and also the size variation. Now I also want to control the thickness of the floorboard edges. And so we have this mortar size here. So this mortar scale, we can just drag this over here and stick it into this extra socket here. And then if you double click on it to rename it, I'll rename it to floorboards edge size. Then I want to be able to control the roughness of the material. So I'll select one of the group inputs and I'll duplicate it, drag it down here. I can press Alt P to bring it out of the frame. And I'm going to bring it over here to the roughness. And I'm going to stick it here underneath this color ramp. So this value here is going to make it lighter or darker. So that's going to control the roughness. So I'll put the value into the extra socket here. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename it to roughness. Then I want to be able to control the bump strength. So I'll duplicate the group input. I'll press Alt P to bring it out of the frame. Let's stick it here inside this bump frame, and I can just drag it back here. And I first want to add in this one here. This is going to be the knots. So we'll take the strength, put that into the extra socket here. And if you click on the group input and open up the interface here on group, I want to double click on this to rename it. And I'll rename this one to knots bump strength. Then I want to control the wood bump strength, so I'll put the strength into the extra socket. I can double click on this, and I'm going to rename this to wood bump strength. And then the last one here is going to be the floorboards, so I'll put the strength into the extra socket, double click on this, and I'll rename it to floorboards bump strength. And then finally, I want to be able to control the wood rotation so that you can rotate this depending on the rotation of your object. So let's go way back over here to this mapping, and this rotation here, I can plug this into the extra socket way down here. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename it to wood rotation. So now many of these group inputs are really big and that doesn't look very nice. So I'm just going to press the N key to close the side panel so I have this in a bigger view. And I'm going to click on each group input and I'll press Control H. So Control H will minimize that. And let's just drag this up here. Select this one, Control H just to minimize that. Just to keep it nicely organized, Control H, I can drag this down here, maybe bring this down a little bit and bring this down a little bit. All right, this one, Control H, just to minimize that. I can bring this up here. And let's go over to this one, Control H and Control H, just to minimize that. Control H, make that smaller. And this one here, Control H, drag this down here. And then this one's overlapping, so I'll press Control H just to hide that. So I'll hit the Tab key to go outside the node group. I'll save this file again, and we can now review the finished material. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material. Then we just have the wood scale. And then we also have the different colors. So color 1 is a lighter wood, and then color 2 is a darker wood. Then we have the knots texture scale to make much more knots if you want them. And then we have the knots single size, so you can make the knots really big if you want to. Then we have the floorboard's length to kind of randomize that. And we also have the floorboard's width. And if you kind of turn this down, that makes kind of an interesting wood with really thin boards. Then we have the floorboard's edge size. And if you turn this up, it kind of looks like a stylized wood. Then we have the roughness of the material. And then we have 3 bump strengths. So we have the knots bump strength. Then we have the wood bump strength. And then the floorboard's bump strength. And then we also have the wood rotation. So if you're looking at this from an object, maybe from top view, you might want to rotate this over. So you could, for example, turn the wood rotation to like 90 to kind of rotate that over. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to purchase the finished procedural material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the Blender Market. I'll have all the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And if you'd like to just purchase my wood materials, then you can check out my Blender Procedural Wood Material Pack number 1, and that just comes with my 10 procedural wood materials. You can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist. The links are all in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.